welcome everyone to the second in our series of Unpacked live programs. As we meet here on Greater Naarm within the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation. The Kulin Nation being a collective of 5 Aboriginal clans, the Wurundjeri, Boonwurrung, Wathaurong, Taungurung and Dja Dja Wurrung, as we enter into wombat season, as we are in wombat season, which runs from April through to July. It's the 3rd of the 7 recognised seasons of the Wurundjeri peoples. And in the spirit of reconciliation, I pay my respects to all elders, past and present, and remind everyone that sovereignty has never been ceded, and this land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd also like to welcome Stephen Rendall, artist and lecturer from the School of Art. Stephen is here to discuss his 2018 painting Recent Developments. Stephen emigrated to Australia in 2000, I think. Studied at the Royal College of Art in London.
Academy,
sorry.
The Royal College is a cool one. The Academy was a bit kind of like mad at that time. Yeah.
And you did your PhD at Monash University.
Yeah, and I finished it too.
In 2015, is that correct? Yeah.
Well, I did it, yeah, that's when I finished it.
Yeah. And I've also brought along, just to run with the conversation, another work from the collection, which is this Hugh Ramsay painting from 1895. And the reason why I wanted to bring this painting along was just to talk about figuration within painting and art. Whenever I look at this work, I always think of Gerhard Richter's Betty. It's kind of unavoidable with that averted gaze. And in this particular painting, I always see the figure in its fragmented way, and it sort of gives me a dialogue with this work and Gerhard Richter's Betty. For those of you who don't remember Gerhard's amazing painting of 1988 painting of his 11-year-old daughter, it caused quite a stir, because even though we've seen that averted gaze through the history of art in many different ways, talking about form, as does the Hugh Ramsay, it wasn't until Gerhard sort of conceptualised it, of course, and made it a thing. But yeah, figuration, Stephen, how do you see figuration? What role do you see it playing in your painting?
Well, with apologies to some of the students here who might have heard me mention this before, it's kind of interesting to think about, well, I'm interested to think about that kind of threshold between figuration and not figuration. So there's a couple of exhibitions coming up soon that are actually dwelling on that. There's one called Thin Skin at Mama, curated by the wonderful Jennifer Higgy. I think that's in July after the Renaissance exhibition. So that's a survey of paintings, international and Australian, that kind of, where either the practices or the works themselves move across that threshold. And Jennifer Higgy called it thin skin because of the thin skin of the paint, you know, this thin layer, and then thin-skinned is a sort of, you know, it's a way of saying that you're sensitive if you're thin-skinned, don't be so thin-skinned. And then there's another one coming up at the Cunahan, which is sort of across that same sort of strange threshold of where there might be something figurative, but there's other kind of forces at play in the painting. So the Ramsay
Yes.
is clearly a figurative painting, and that was his intention, to make a figurative painting. It's from life. Would you call it a study?
Absolutely.
A study from life. It's, you know, it's got all of that beautiful observation and all of that, you know, kind of academic rigor, but also sensitivity and the other connection that Nick just said about the averted gaze, you know, there's somebody turning away. So that's clearly figurative, whereas I actually kind of end up with some kind of figuration through a different process. and sometimes it kind of like, it dissolves into all the fragments and the figuration becomes sort of much more kind of, what's the word, mangled and refracted and kind of broken. This one's sort of one of the clearer ones. So it is, you know, like if you, a few quick sort of online searches for figuration in contemporary painting throw up all sorts of things about whether it's, you know, dead and buried or the next greatest thing or whatever. You know, it's just this ongoing current in practice, you know, in ways of thinking about what it is, you know, to make a painting. So yeah, that's kind of an answer, I think. You know.
So in terms of that, can you talk a little bit about your process in this fragmented way of capturing the
good segue.
The picture?
So
great segue, because Stephen's been so kind to bring in some of his source material that he creates. But in that, I just want to say that it is all right for them to be passed around, but if you could be mindful of your coffees and whatnot.
Yeah. Because they're already in such good condition, as you'll see, that a few coffee stains is going to make a huge difference to them. So this is part of the process. So, and that's that, you know, as again, some of the students will probably be sick of that word process, but it's really important, that process. For me, it's also important as a way of kind of like inventing different processes. There's a certain baseline involving a kind of a grid somewhere along the line, and even that gets a bit dissolved. But there's different processes and different ways of doing it, different ways of fragmenting something. Sometimes that's pragmatic in order to do something within a certain time frame. You know, I sort of had, it was the body of work before this, I kind of really learnt that one where, you know, I'd be in the studio and I had my day in the studio, but I had to leave at 3-ish to go and pick my daughter up from school, and it sort of gets to 2:30 and it's like, oh shit, I've got to finish this painting, you know. So some shortcuts were taken and it's like, oh, that's quite interesting, these shortcuts, how quickly you can get something done. So I'm very interested in the pragmatics of things. Anyway, these are collages that are... Do you want me to go into the whole backstory about how I ended up with the collages?
I think you'd be really interested. And I
So-
might just add that if anyone wants to interject and ask questions, please do. That's what we're here for.
So, years and years ago, I think it was when I first started teaching at RMIT, I was teaching a painting elective. And at that stage, it was in Building 2, in one of the tutorial rooms. And somebody had left a whole load of auction house catalogues. So, auction house catalogues from Sotheby's, Deutsche and Hackett, and possibly Christie's, I can't remember. There was just a whole load of auction house catalogues that had all these beautiful photographs of works of art being sold on the secondary art market. And they'd left them there for us to like use as collage material, basically. So the first one I did, and this is a bit revealing, the first one I did is I was sifting through, wondering what to do, and the students were in the room doing it too, and there was sort of like, you know, fragments of paintings littering the floor, which I found quite interesting. And the first one I did, which I kind of think I might have lost actually, is that there was a painting of the Queen. So apologies to anyone who's a royalist. There's a painting of the Queen, and I chopped her head off. Because I was thinking, you know, the thing with the collage is the cut, the slice, and decapitation seemed to be, you know, beheading seemed to be an obvious thing. So that was the first one, and then I kind of went, sort of like really started playing with it on a whole load of different in a whole load of different ways. Somebody else left me a huge stack of the secondary art market catalogues as well. It was a bit of a revenge as well, because I have got, you know, before I was teaching, I worked in install and hung a lot of those paintings on the wall and watched those prices go up. So it was kind of funny to find images of them and then slice them up, you know. So and I did actually throw them out recently. There's a whole load of auction house catalogues that are just sort of like wrecks because I was cutting the things out, but there's only so much room in the studio. But these are the collages that are then kind of gridded up to be made into the paintings. Now, that's probably the simplest one. That one actually ended up being in a small painting for the 9x5 fundraiser at the VCA,
yeah.
which I think Ramsey had a 9x5, didn't
Absolutely.
he? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was quite glad to find that one.
Do you ever have people come up and say, "Oh, that piece is from a particular painting"?
No, you see, this is the interesting thing. I was expecting that to be a bit of a problem, but it wasn't. I think
a bit of a problem, or
it wasn't. Nobody complained. So that's that one. Yeah. Some of these have been made into paintings, and some haven't. And like my collages, my collages get wrecked. You can see the state of them. Anyway, they're working documents. What often happens in the process of making the collage is they then make the painting and then get really dissatisfied because I haven't done something right in the composition and something's just really annoying me. So the collages get recollaged in response to the painting. So some of them actually get really quite thick, and you'll see there's bits of tape and stuff on the back of them where other bits have been sliced out and kind of put back in.
That was going to be my next question. A lot of people will say, when in regards to making works of art, making paintings, whatever, where does it end? How do you finish? When's it resolved? But now you're sort of working on two layers of how to resolve, because you're working with the collage and then you rework the collage onto the painting.
I do have this sort of compulsion to fill things up. Like to fill the space up. This is probably one of the. And I'm working on that to try and work with empty space as well as full space. So some of the ones, there's probably some in here that got really stacked up. So I was kind of, those ones. I was kind of lining it up with, when you fill a glass of water up and the rim of the water just comes over the top of the glass. I'm trying to get the equivalent of that in a painting. So it's so full that if you tap it, the whole thing sort of spills, So it's to try and create a fullness. I know it's sort of a bit vague, but it was kind of like the feeling I had in the studio. And it didn't always work. It got quite, I had to keep testing it. And some of the paintings, didn't quite make it in the way that I wanted to. But there's that sense of fullness. The other thing, just in terms of that practicality, is you can see from the collage is it's section by section. So if I only had a limited amount of time in the studio, well, I still only do have a limited amount of time in the studio, I could do a section and then walk away, knowing that section's done. So each section is done in kind of one hit, and you can see it's pretty rushed in places, it's like do it quickly, get it done.
Steve,
Yes.
are you compelled, like if it was a whole painting, would you be compelled to stay in the studio and keep painting?
That works well, and but it doesn't. It's sort of a bit hit and miss. I'm really inconsistent. So that was one of the things in this sort of collage way of working that really it sort of helped the inconsistency be like a positive rather than a negative attribute. Yeah. But compulsion is a really interesting thing when it comes to painting. There is a compulsion there. I don't think I'm. It's not quite. There's a book on the Mona Lisa, on the stealing of the Mona Lisa, by Darian Leader, who's a psychoanalyst, and he talks about various sort of ways that people make paintings, and he talks about how some people, the painting's finished when all the tubes of paint are empty. Which I think is arbitrary, but a really interesting idea. It's like when everything's done, when all the materials are used, that's when it's finished. I kind of recognise a bit of that. I try and then modify that. He also talks about how there's a whole load of things started, but nothing's quite finished. In various practices. So this idea about like avoiding the finish. So there's kind of like that word compulsion. Just to borrow the title of this thing, unpacks a whole load of other cans of worms, if that's too many metaphors.
Inconsistent.
Consistently inconsistent. Yeah. There's two. You were first.
Why the scale?
I really like big paintings. It's as simple as that. I think there's something at stake. I find it quite hard making small paintings. And also small paintings, I just do them and then they don't work. So, but maybe that also cuts back to Nick's opening question about figuration, is the figure is sort of human, it's my size in the studio. I mean, it's high on the wall here and in this fantastic metal grid that I really like. I want to frame it on this. I want to borrow one of these now, you know. But it's that thing about having the painting kind of like equal to me in the studio space.
We spoke in our last session about Agnes Martin and the format that Agnes used for many, many years, which was a 6x6. And it essentially meant that her figure was engulfed by this frame, but didn't go beyond that frame, and that there's a reference point, a direct reference point with the artist's stature and the framework.
It's also, I mean, this sort of format's actually quite easy to move around in the studio. Occasionally I do, well, quite often, too many times, I do something that's just a bit beyond my reach, and it's like, why did I do it like that? I can't like move it around, you know. Yeah. But it's that figurative presence. I mean, it's quite, I do, like I said, I do actually really like big paintings like that. I don't think it's that big, but big-ish. Just a little bit bigger than easel painting.
So we had another question, yeah?
Yeah, I was going to ask about what is it about fragmentation
as
a form that really interests you?
Yeah.
Because I can sort of see that there's probably a number of kind of things, reasons why you work in this way.
I think that's a really good kind of answer to the question. There's a lot of reasons. It's sort of quite layered, and it's sort of, some of them elude me in the moment. But I mean, one of them is that practicality. You know, to be able to do something in short time frames. So I don't, you know, like, it would be amazing to have days in a row and that luxury to just sort of work on something, but that's not always possible. So, you know, I'll work with the limitations. So the limitations of time are just like the limitations of the edge or the limitations of how much material you've got. So the fragmentation helped that. It was a way of kind of surprising myself as well about how things went together and testing that, you know, to see if things would, how they sort of held together or kind of disintegrated, and also to bring in that level of, so the fragmentation is for me a kind of counterpoint to the obvious figurative approach, because it fractures that figurative approach. So the Ramsay's very complete and whole and beautifully composed. And this is kind of like the opposite of all of those things. Fragmentation's also, I mean, I think I've long been interested in the fragment or the leftover or the ruin. You know, like you start thinking about all these other things, it kind of like sets off these trains of thoughts about what the fragment is and what you might do with it and what it reveals.
What about the relationship of the form to the content? You know, the things that you actually choose to include in your compositions?
Well, that was kind of something to do with categories. So this body of work, and there's a catalogue around somewhere as well, were all taken from the auction house catalogues. So I was kind of taking from, you know, paintings that were in the secondary market. There is a predilection towards sort of figurative elements that I could slice up and recombine in a sort of like, you know, Frankensteinian way. I was thinking also about like when you bring different parts of bodies together, that there was something, it kind of recalled how demons are kind of like assembled in various sort of cultures and histories. So the demon is a composite figure, you know? So a few of the paintings in here are kind of named after various demons that I just looked up. So this idea of the demon having like multiple parts and multiple voices as well. So that bit in the film The Exorcist, which quotes from the Bible when the demon is being exorcised, the demon is asked its name, and the demon says, call me Legion, for we are many. So this idea about multiple voices. So for me, the painting has got multiple voices because of all these other fragments of artworks flowing through it. Does that sort of answer your question?
Absolutely.
I don't want to get too much into the demon thing, but it is quite fascinating, you know, and that story about, you know, that quote in The Exorcist, call me Legion for we are many, it's kind of an interesting, it's the scary thing about the demon and the demonic in that particular context, that it doesn't have a single identity, it's multiple, you know.
So referring back to the idea of remnants and bits and pieces from the auction catalogues, when a painting doesn't work, which you mentioned earlier, does that then get repurposed and fragmented once again to create another work, or do you just destroy them?
that's a whole other kind of story, because there's only a limited amount of storage, as you would know, being the collections manager. You know, there's only a limited amount of storage, and in studios there's only a limited amount of storage, especially if you're stupid enough to make 6-foot-high paintings. So some of them, and I had a discussion with Peter Westwood about this at my opening last week, and he told me off basically, because I did say that, well, I actually destroy some of the paintings that, you know, that don't quite make it. And he said, you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't do that. It's like, well, I kind of have to, because otherwise I'm going to run out of room. So, you know, a few things do get destroyed. It's really annoying when the gallerist phones up and says, have you got that painting in the studio? Because somebody wants to buy it now. It's like, oh. So I've had to kind of repaint a couple of things. But I've got the template here. My archiving is awful, you know, like, but there are, somewhere in the studio, there are folders with everything in them. So, you know, but then that's also been a kind of a topic of my work in the past. So this is kind of one work in a collection, which is kind of a collection of other works in this method. And in the Monash University Museum of Art, there's another painting called Cadaver, which is a painting that depicts a whole load of industrial shelving units, the lovely like high-vis orange shelving units that you see in warehouses, absolutely crammed full of rolled up, well, I think the original image was possibly rolled up carpets, but I kind of read it as rolled up paintings. And then there's a couple of others after that as well, which really take that to the nth degree. So this idea about the nightmare of storage, which if you're making objects like big paintings, I mean, sculptures, people who make big sculptures, well, actually, who was it who was talking about it recently, about that problem? Rachel Whiteread, talking about all of the commissions for sculptures on that fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square in London. And all the artists were commissioned to make these big works for that plinth. But of course they were commissioned for a specific site, and they're big. So they never sold afterwards. So the artists have like burnt through their commission storing these things, you know. So this sort of nightmare of storage became, that's in the history of what it is that I do. This is a kind of variation on that, storage of fragments. You know?
Yeah, sure. So did you have another question?
I was talking about these lines you draw across. Do they help you edit, or are they like positional?
Yeah,
You preempted my next question.
Yeah, they're the grid. The grid I kind of have this battle with. I find it. It's kind of, I'm kind of addicted to it as a way of working, because it just works. And I'm constantly trying to disrupt it and play with it or get rid of it. But it's a translation device. So if you've got one image this big, the grid is then translated onto this. And well, you can see the collage for this one is a lot narrower. I've stretched the whole image. And in the current show at Niagara, I've actually skewed the grid as well. So it's beginning to distort things.
What about the lines? Like sometimes they have ovals over them, or
the diagonal is just another way of lining things up,
right.
just to find another cross relation, so I can work quickly. So I'm not spending time wondering where something goes. I know it goes there. But the grid sometimes gets drawn back in over the top of the painting, and then sometimes, not so much with these ones, but with some of the smaller ones, begins to actually function as not just a translation device, but actually a way of kind of like dividing up, almost digitizing, but on a kind of like really blocky scale, an image. So it gets drawn back through.
Did you start making these, like, how long have you made them? So I think, like, pre-internet, did you make these pre-internet, this methodology?
I'm not that old.
Or like, thinking about algorithms and, you know, like this very contemporary experience.
Ah, I see what you mean. Yeah. Well, yeah, I've been using the grid since, like, I was in undergraduate in Leicester in the early 90s. I guess that's sort of before everyone.
Just the fragments of, you know, like,
Yeah.
conceptually, it makes me think about algorithms.
Yeah, well, that
Interrupted and, like...
yeah, that might actually go. I meant to say earlier on. After that might actually connect up to what I was going to say. So, this work and the works in the catalogue were all from the secondary art market, so the auction house catalogues. But then I started thinking I've really got to play around with the categories here, or to use your word, Larissa, the algorithms. Yeah. So I started opening up the categories. So I've got this vast pile of big pile of books in the library on the unexplained, or all the occult sort of compendium books that you can find in savers and stuff like that, and charity shops. That I was kind of obsessed with when I was a kid, actually. So, and then there's one of the categories was, 1001 films you must see before you die. So I kind of found all these, like, again, they're all like leftovers in savers or charity shops, books that I could collage, but also would open up the categories. So this was a kind of real closing down, if you like, of what's coming in to the way of making. So it's just works from the secondary art market, and then I sort of broke that and opened that up as a way of kind of just expanding the possibilities of pushing things. And the categories now are kind of like really open. So I guess categories could be a way of thinking about. You said algorithms, like what's driving something, what's the input or what's the guideline, I've been to a few exhibitions that have AI as part of their makeup, and it has its moment. It'll be more and more of it,
Just seeing it reflects like culture, like the work reflects culture.
Yeah. Well, it reflects the market as well, doesn't it, this one? Like that's another thing, the market, the secondary art market. So in a way, it's kind of quite cynical as an approach. But hopefully that cynicism is redeemed by other things happening through the process of making the painting. I came up with this dumb analogy a little while ago. It's like you can have a really stupid idea, but redeem it through the process of making something. That flip around that usually says that you've got to have a good idea. Just any idea would be all right, and redeem it somehow,
But just keeping on with the grid, and we know, as you said, that you use it as a formal way of reproducing the image from the collage. But of late, it seems to be becoming a little bit more of a protagonist in the painting, a little bit more of a main player in that it's come forward as opposed to be remaining in the background.
Well, are you referring to the exhibition that's on at the moment?
Yeah.
So there's an exhibition of works on at Niagara Galleries at the moment called What Do Paintings See? And the idea of a protagonist in the painting is quite interesting. So it's sort of, if you say that something like a grid is functioning as a protagonist, you're kind of giving it some kind of agency. It's doing something, it's acting. So, and that's what I was sort of, interested in with that exhibition is, what do paintings see? It's a riff, if you like, on Mitchell's What Do Pictures Want? And Isabella Graff's ideas about agency of a painting, what it does. And all those myths, like those old favourites, about I guess surrealism had something to do with it, with automatic ways of making something, and Francis Bacon talking about the materials telling him what to do, and all those conversations we have in the studio about listen to the materials. Like, I can't hear anything. What are you talking about? They're just inert until you squirt them out of the tube or whatever you do with them, whatever materials you're working with. But there is something in there. And Mitchell kind of like, his is the best sort of theory about that, about what do pictures want. And so I've used that, one of his quotes, in relation to that current exhibition about, you know, what is it that the pictures want? So then I rephrase that, what do the pictures see? So this idea about them being, you know, they see it, they're seeing somehow, seeing us, which is, it's when you read the Mitchell quote, it makes a lot more sense than I'm making of it. I think the paintings sometimes are smarter than I am as well, which is quite nice, you know. But this idea about what do paintings see, what do they want, what drives them, you know, and I'm just sort of there in the studio, kind of like hopefully facilitating that and helping that.
Now, I have to ask you about your sculptural works, which
Oh, yeah.
anyone who's been following Stephen on Instagram will know that there's been a number of demons, as you refer to them,
Yeah.
and villains emerging from his sculptural practice. Could you talk a little bit about where those works are going and
Yeah, well,
and why you're making them, essentially?
One of them got wheeled through the streets of Brunswick a little while ago, which was quite funny. The big sort of grey one. The sculpture I've been involved. I've made sculpture on and off for quite a long time. Some of it gets shown, some of it doesn't. When I first moved here in 2000, I think I had one of those sort of like compulsive phases, and I made plaster casts of everything I could find in the house that I could then break off. So a banana, for example,
That's in my bathroom.
yeah, you've got that one, have you?
I've got that one.
So the banana. So I cut the banana skin open, took the banana, the fruit out, and used the banana skin as a mould for a plaster cast. Oranges, coins, all sorts of things that I could break off. Bottles, condoms, anything that I could break off or get off of the plaster. And I actually showed it at the Yarra Sculpture Galleries on the floor. I drew a grid on the floor and put them each piece in one square of the grid and sold them for like $50 or something like that. It was pretty cheap.
Did you paint them? Or
No, they were just plaster. Sometimes they picked up a residue of what they came from. My favourite one was the glove, the hand. So I sort of propped up a marigold. I've got to stop referring to it as marigolds because nobody knows what I'm talking about. A washing up glove, yeah? And just filled it full of plaster, and it made this sort of, that's now sat on a bookshelf somewhere, I think.
Basically looked like what was his name? Thing from the...
Yeah,
Addams
Thing. Well,
Family.
that was my next, thank you, Thing. That's the other thing. So with the ones at the moment, I've sort of referred to them. We did a show in the Cunahan Gallery in one of the lockdowns, and I titled it The Things Between the Other Things. So the sculptures I'm making don't quite attain the quality of an object. They're a thing. So they're kind of like, they could be just like some junk stuck together, or they could be a sculpture, or they could be something that just stops me going mad at home during lockdowns and all the domestic sort of stuff, you know. So they're the things between other things. So some of them grew quite big because the lockdowns lasted for quite a long time here. So there are 3 kind of like 6-foot ones on wheels that are currently sat in the abandoned office on the back decking of the house. And then there's a whole load of little ones where they vary from like, you know, that to that. And they were very much made on the kitchen table at home. They're domestic sculptures.
Can I ask on that, when you're talking about that, what do you think the relationship is or differences between an object and a thing?
Well, there was a conference and a book that came out a little while ago that talked about that. I'm trying to remember exactly. Well, I'm sort of still reading that book actually. A thing is something. Well, there's a great horror film called The Thing. It's really, really good, and the thing can be anything in that film. So the thing is
it's not specified.
multivalent, non-specified. An object is more specified, I think. So there's not many horror films called The Object, but the object just doesn't work in the same way. You know, the object on the doorstep. So the posters arrive, fantastic. You know, the thing on the doorstep, or the damned thing, on the other hand, have got like, you know, we don't quite know what it is. So there's a kind of horror in that. They talk. I think what's the book? What was the book in the conference called? The Desire for the Object, or something like that. I think it was called. And in the introduction, the writer talks about whether they call it a thing or an object. And the object was more specific. The thing could be, it's not quite defined. That was how they articulated it. There are actually, if you do like a peer-reviewed search on the library for thing, you'll find some really interesting articles on it, often with a tendency towards thinking about it, how it functions in horror.
Do you find that paintings are more real than your collages?
That's a really good question. That's a really, really good one. More real than the collage.
Because you're just sort of like that definition between the thing and the object.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, do you consider the painting an object and your collage is just a thing?
For a while, I was thinking that the paintings were an excuse to make really, really crap collages that had fingerprints all over them, which you're not supposed to do in collage. I don't know, because I think these are quite physical as things. I don't know. I like keep that as a question. I think that's an open one. It's really, which is more real.
What about authenticity?
What about authenticity?
Well, in the context between the what you might call a process,
Yeah.
and the outcome which you're prepared to destroy, because the process element is still extant.
Well, I mean, given the fact I've hijacked all the bits of images in it, it's sort of a compromised authenticity, to say the very least. You know.
I suppose, yeah, it's a curious relation between the two.
Yeah.
Not so much the authenticity to the source, but
Between this as a sort of like printed document and the painting.
yeah, off the back of the object and of the.
Yeah. I mean,
Which one's more real?
yeah, this or the painting. I mean, the other thing is how we encounter artworks and paint. You know, apologies to students in the room, but trying to get students to go and see exhibitions. You know, go and see exhibitions. You know, nobody goes. You know. Visit Melbourne now, so I stop pestering you about it. You know, but but then I'm looking at reproductions. You know, like these. That's why I'm not. You know, if Ramsey wanted to make a copy of somebody's painting, he would go to the Louvre. Or, did he ever go to Paris? Did Ramsey ever go to Paris? Yeah. You know, he'd do it. You know, he'd copy the real thing. I'm copying photographs, which links back to how Richter sort of thinks.
Stephen, have you ever had a letter from the Howard Art History?
No. I was wondering about that. I was wondering if I would have, and I spoke to Bill Nuttall, who's the gallery director of Niagara, and he wasn't concerned, and he's fairly, you know, he's got a lot of history and knowledge.
Music.
Well, yes, but I'm glad you brought up music, because one of my in the background of all of this is somebody like the KLF, the Copyright Liberation Front, who had to destroy all of their recordings where they hijacked the ABBA song. And do you know how they did that as well? So their first single?
Yeah.
They basically took an ABBA song and then laid another thing over the top, and that was it. They did very little apart from like realize that they could splice things together. And then the ABBA's record company sued them for copyright infringement. So they boxed up all the records, drove over to where ABBA are from to try and demonstrate in front of the members of ABBA that they were destroying the records. Of course, they didn't find them. They couldn't find Bjorn and Benny and that lot. But they tried. They really tried, you know, to demonstrate that destruction, you know. It opens up all those other kind of connections with the idea of sampling, appropriation. So I haven't. When I first started doing this, I was thinking I really should keep notes, but it got so big and complicated that I would have spent more time keeping notes and footnoting what I was doing than not. But of course, there's that, and I had in mind that Juan de Villa painting, where he labels all the different fragments that he's taking from, and does that beautiful sort of, you know, handwriting to label that he's taking it from whichever artist. So I was, you know, aware of that. I was obviously aware of the appropriation of Gordon Bennett, and the colonial sort of clashes that he's bringing together in those paintings. But again, didn't want to do that, But no, nobody. I was quite like I said, I was quite surprised that nobody objected.
It's like AI, it's what AI is doing too.
I'm really bad AI. Yeah, I'm a slower learner than AI.
It's interesting.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
It's like copyright issues. AI is essentially just like blending.
Yeah.
But I think it's possibly more due to the fact that they're fragments and it's not copying on a whole, and that you're actually working with a tradition. So if you, for instance, were thinking about the folk tradition in music, that's how songs are generated from other people's songs, but they're fragmentary elements that develop. And I see, I can see a little bit of Jeffrey Smart, but it's not
I was going to say that Jeffrey Smart's
paint
arrows.
like Jeffrey Smart.
No.
Yeah, but of course somebody painted them on the road that he drew them from.
Exactly.
Nice.
Original artist.
Can I pick up on that question about appropriation?
Yeah.
Because you've used a number of artists that use appropriation
Yeah.
for sort of social political
Yes.
commentary.
Yeah.
And yes, we've got Jeffrey Smart, we've got Bill Henson, and then we've got David Bromley.
Yeah.
Whoa!
I know.
I'm interested because I could recover that from the collage,
Yeah.
not from the painting.
Yeah, well,
So
yeah.
I'm interested in are there particular subtexts running through these paintings, or particular things you're trying to flag without really speaking to?
Yeah, I hope so, but they weren't necessarily intended. It was more to see what happened with that. So it wasn't like, oh, if I put David Bromley with Henson and Smart, it will say this. So it's not an equation. It's more like bad AI that can't discern between like a quality thing and a not so quality thing, And also that in the market. So when you get those fantastic auction house catalogues, it flattens out the difference between all of those practices, and they're all. It doesn't, because there's actually some beautiful short form essays written in there, and the people at the auction houses, depending on how well the market is going, do write really, really well and do the research. When times are harder, the research is constrained, and they can't always do it so well. But in a way, all of those works end up being flattened out and just having a price next to them, and then being resold at the next auction. So I thought it was, I guess, I don't want to get into morals and ethics too much, but it kind of seemed like fair game to take stuff from the secondary art market. So in a way, I don't know if it's a critique of the market, because I then put them on show and hope that they sell. But then none of my works have actually ended up in the secondary art market, Well, one ended up in a kind of like dodgy antique place in New South Wales once, but at least they got the label right.
How did you find that?
An ex-student sent me a photograph of it, yeah. It was in one of those, like antique sort of like market warehouse places. And she was looking at the paintings there and noticed the name and went, oh, that's one of yours, It was a collaborative work I did with Brian Spear when we were at, I had a residency at St Vincent's Hospital, the now demolished Aikenhead building.
Now, very conscious of time.
Oh, yes, lunchtime.
Does anyone have any brief question to finish off?
Can I ask, do you see what you're doing as a reverse of the normal process, with the collage being reproduction and you're doing the painting of reproduction instead of the painting being reproduced as the collage?
I think somebody sent me a message recently apologising that they couldn't come to my latest show, and talked about reverses, inverses, and I think verses as well. So I think it's in flux. It's going backwards and forwards, and sort of. Like I said, sometimes I think that these are better than the paintings, or more real, or the paintings are an excuse for me to do these things. So I think it flows back and forth for me in relation to whether it's reverse or forward or inversed.
I think you're slowly answering your question.
I'm getting there.
Yeah.
I'm getting there.
No, but
well,
it's interesting.
well, yeah.
It's evolving.
Yeah.
thank you all for coming. Big shout out to Simon and Maisch, who's been recording this whole event, who's a part of our amazing production team in culture. Stephen's show is on until the 27th of May.
Yeah, at Niagara
At
Galleries.
Niagara Galleries. It's
Yeah.
a great show. Go and see it. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.